Hello, everyone, and welcome to the launch of Inappropriate. This is the third book of our fall collection. It's edited by Kim Davids Mandar. It's a collection of interviews with Canadian authors on how they work through questions of difference. The interviews in this collection address questions of appropriation that go beyond race and culture, extending also to gender, sexuality, ability, age, and other categories of difference. They ask how writers work to represent an increasingly diverse and complex culture in ways that avoid falling into appropriation. The launch today is going to feature a Q&A with the audience and readings by the contributors to the collection of their own works. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat. If you aren't familiar with the chat function, you can just type in the box and hit enter to send. That'll go to everyone. If you want to message someone directly, you can click on where it says everyone, and there's a drop-down list, and then you can just select the person to send it to. Jeremy, are questions going to you, or would it be in the general chat?
So we said if people want to direct things to individual authors, they can. If they want to have it in the general chat, they can. If you'd like it to be anonymous, you can send it to me or to Kim.
Perfect. So some quick notables. The mute function is very important. Please remain muted when the readers are presenting. There will be the opportunity at the end to turn on your microphones to chat with each other. When you are speaking, please use headphones to avoid feedback. At this time, it hasn't seemed like we've experienced feedback, but just in case that does happen, a good way to avoid having feedback is to use headphones. When the speakers are talking, please select speaker view so you have the reader full screen, and you can toggle this selection by in the top right hand corner it says view, and there's gallery or speaker. If anything happens at any time that makes you feel uncomfortable, please message me, Vanessa. You can private message me in the chat, and I'm happy to talk. And there's a live transcription that you can read by clicking on the top left link to Otter. There is a drop-down menu where you click on.
Yeah, I will.
It says view stream on otter.ai live notes. As we gather, we are reminded that Guelph is situated on treaty land that is steeped in rich Indigenous history and home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples today. We acknowledge that we are situated on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabeg peoples, specifically the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. We're privileged to live, work, and create in this territory and must act with awareness and solidarity. We encourage you to educate yourself about where the land that you occupy, wherever you're tuning in from, and you can find this out at native-land.ca, and I can post a link in the chat. And now I'll hand it off to Luke.
Thanks so much for coming, everybody. I just want to start off with thanking all the people who were involved in this project. It's a big project. It involves a lot of people in a lot of different ways, and it was really a treat to be involved with so many people, having them contribute their time and their effort towards this. So I just want to thank all the people who played their part in it. And I can just want to direct you to the website. If you want to buy a copy, you can do that at gordonhillpress.com. And I'm just going to throw a message in the chat right now for the link, and you can go there. If you have any questions about anything, feel free to be in touch with us. And I'll turn it over to Kim to be our MC for the day.
Thanks, Luke, and yes, thank you everyone for coming. I'm so excited. This is very exciting to be all in the same room together. I think over the past couple of years, it's been very disconnected in some ways, but also very exciting in its own way. But it's a long project, and this is a really beautiful next step. So thank you to Gordon Hill Press, and thank you everyone who contributed and made this possible, and thank you to everyone for being here today on such a sunny day. I hope you got out before you sat down in your Zoom chair. But let's get started with some readings. So our first reader is Sanchari Sur. Sanchari is a 2019 recipient of a Banff Center residency with electric literature and a 2018 Lambda Literary Fellow in Fiction. Their work can be found in Toronto Book Award, shortlisted The Unpublished City, in 2017, Prism International, Humber Literary Review, Room, Arc Poetry Magazine, and elsewhere. She's a doctoral candidate in English at Wilfrid Laurier University and the curator and co-founder of Balderdash Reading Series, which was established in January of 2017. Welcome, Sanchari.
Thank you, Kim. Again, I'm really happy to be here and happy to be a part of this project, which was, I didn't know what this was when you first reached out to me, so I almost missed out on it. So I always think about that. Anyway, so I'm gonna read my short story from the Unpublished City. Mars in Scorpio. 1. I had neglected to remember him by the time I moved to Canada. He was my Baba's friend's son. We lived at the two respective neighboring ends that made up the tip of the boot, snug between the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. Our fathers, who were school friends, had recently connected over email. There were talks of family visits, but nothing came of it. It was during this time that for some reason, our fathers decided that we could also become friends. In their minds, our age was an assumed bridge. We were 14, that awkward, vulnerable period when it was, I suppose, easier to strike up a faceless conversation. We exchanged a few emails, talking mainly about books and movies. My Nancy Drews competing with his Hardy Boys, my love for horror over his sci-fi. We discovered that even though our afternoons had similar arcs, napping mothers, we spent them differently. While I chose to curl up with a book, his poison was trying to conquer a Roman settlement on his computer screen. And as enthusiastic as he had been in his extensive meditative responses, just as suddenly he very enthusiastically stopped writing. My Mars is in Scorpio, which is perhaps why I was quick to take offense. I never followed up, never cared to inquire why. I imagined in the new age of internet revolution, when online dating was commonplace through ICQ, he had found someone in a zip code to keep him busy. It was only when we moved to Mississauga 4 years later that Baba brought up his name. Do you remember Ronnie? He said. Who? The punker uncle's son, the one you wrote emails to. The one who lived in Muscat? The same. He stopped writing, I remember. Yes, he died. I had seen only one dead person in my short lifetime. She was my friend's grandmother, a stern woman laid out on the family bed, austere in her widow's sari. I was 6 then. I gaped curiously at her nostrils stuffed with cotton wool. It was later when I read that on dying, people start leaking from places. I wondered if she had been stuffed elsewhere as well. Muscle dystrophy when he was 14, father said, as if it was self-explanatory. His family is in Mississauga now.
Theater by the Bay.
Muscular dystrophy is a genetic disorder that gradually weakens the body's muscles. It is caused by incorrect or missing genetic information that prevents the body from making the proteins needed to build and maintain healthy muscles. A child who's diagnosed with muscle dystrophy gradually loses the ability to do things like walk, sit upright, breathe easily, and move the arms and hands. This increasing weakness can lead to other health problems. There is no cure for muscle dystrophy. 3. Our families met often, making road trips, both short and long. I vaguely tolerated their daughter, Rani, a girl much younger in age, and her inane cravings for McDonald's on these trips. We never talked of Ronnie, but he was always there. The silent ghost hanging out with us in the living room, on the beach at Wasaga, breathing out into the January cold in New York, making a face when Rani whined for junk food, or just staring through the windows when our cars passed each other. I hated these outings as much as I had hated Ronnie's silence all those years ago. 4. His family moved to Mumbai before the summer of our second year. They had tried, they said, but in the end, it was the cold that drove them out. So that was my reading. To end my reading, I have a question for Kim. And I know, Kim, you answered a little bit of this in the introduction to the collection. But my question is, why this inappropriate project now? Like, what is the relevance of this project to you in this time?
Ooh, great question. And thank you for that beautiful reading. It links to your PhD, doesn't it? I'm going to circle back to that later. yeah, why this now? Well, first it was a project initiated by Jeremy Luke Hill, and it was in our conversation, I think, that we were exploring the significance of this conversation now, because it's almost like a timeless conversation, right? Because it's always been an issue. As society evolves, we have to revisit social dynamics and power relationships all the time. But I think it was really stimulated by the 2017 issue with the Right publication with the Writers Union of Canada, which hopefully we'll talk about more with Farzana. And we were kind of reeling with that. So I think it was timing, it was also confusion, and then our conversations with people that came to the Eden Mills Writers Festival as well. And there just seemed to be a real depth that people seem to be open to. So we thought, hey, maybe we can go beyond the kind of binaries that happen on social media, and maybe we can flesh this out a little bit in a more complex way and just learn something. Does that answer your question? Thank you for your question. Okay, the next reader and wonderful contributor and one of my former teachers, which I'm really grateful for, is Mahak Jain. Mahak Jain is the author of the picture book Maya, a CBC Best Book of the Year, a Kirkus Best Book of the Year, and winner of the South Asian Book Award. She completed her MFA in creative writing at the University of Guelph. Mahak is born in Delhi and has also lived in Dubai, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Montreal. She currently resides in Toronto, where she's a professor of creative writing. You can learn more about Mahak on her website, www.mahakjain.com. So Mahak, welcome, and please introduce your reading.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me, and thank you to Kim and Jeremy and everyone involved. I know there's a lot of people that are behind the scenes that we're not even aware of, so for making this anthology possible. I'm going to read from a short story called The Marriage Broker. It came out last year in the New Quarterly, which is a wonderful magazine based out of Waterloo in Ontario. It's from a point of view that's very different from mine, so I thought it would be very fitting for today's event. The Marriage Broker. For 16 years, I made my living as a marriage broker, serving an institution older than the government buildings located a few kilometers from my office. Before Pandetker showed up, that stubborn weed of a man, and before Ashna arrived with the kind of face that brands itself in memory, I was a man in demand. Parents used to climb over one another to schedule meetings with me. Meanwhile, the young men of the city, boys really, wanted to be me. Could I blame them? They arrived at my threshold, seeking the satisfaction and security of being employed in an industry built on time-tested foundations. The All India Marriage Bureau reported to higher forces. I said as much to each job seeker. The inadequate were easy to identify. They did not treat the matter with appropriate gravity, but even those with watery enthusiasm I dismissed with delight. You do not have it in you to succeed in this line of work. Of course, as if to punish me for years of prosperity, the day arrived when I had to fire my first employee. Not on a whim, as I would have preferred, but because the business could no longer afford the extravagance of an employee whose only purpose was to greet clients with a garland of marigolds. The marigolds I had already dealt with. Only the matter of Kaku remained. Kaku I had hired in the same manner that I hired my other 15 employees, even though he was only a glorified doorkeeper, while the others under my employ were investigators, secretaries, bookkeepers. On his first day, I walked him to the carts that faced the government offices. Gopal Bhai, as soon as he saw me, scooped out 2 samosas from the oil bubbling dangerously close to his crotch and readied them on a thick wad of newspaper. He was familiar with my method of training employees and without a word swept away the rupees I handed him. Then, for the next 10 minutes, I ignored Kaku, ate first one samosa and then the second under the shade of a peepal tree, watching the so-called civil servants that crawled in and out from the sandstone steps of the building opposite. Like cockroaches, I thought darkly. What do you see? I asked my ward, the same question I asked every boy, though it did not matter how the boy replied, for my rebuttal, practiced and perfected, remained the same. No, what you see is a dog, a stain. Servants? Chee. They serve their own pockets, lining them with the hard-earned money of good Indians. What do these civil servants do, huh? For me, for you? And with a flourish I had timed, I then crumpled up the oily newspaper and threw it in Gopal Bhai's bin so he could retrieve it later for reuse. The work of the All India Marriage Bureau is in service of something larger. We serve India, the very notion of India. Without the marriage broker, there is no past, no present, no future, because without marriage, this country has no heartbeat. Do you understand? At this point, the boys usually wagged before me like dogs, but Kaku confessed the unexpected. He never intended to marry. With his earnings, he said, he planned to arrange marriages for his 2 sisters and then devote himself to his parents, who had no other sons. This was why he was known as Kaku, a moniker reserved for elders that suited him so well even I, his senior, saw its merit. I'm sorry if I have disappointed you, sir, he said, his head drooping towards his scantily clad feet. To my surprise, I was not disappointed. What I felt instead was an unfamiliar thrill. I saw something in the boy that could be relied on, an unexpected boon. He was, in a manner, a necessary celibate, an ascetic devoted to the cause of marriage, and therefore it only made sense that he should be the first at the All India Marriage Bureau to greet a client. I'll stop there, and the rest of the story is available in the New Quarterly. But before returning to Kim, I'd like to ask her, just moving forward with Sanchari's question, how have you been changed by working on this anthology?
I have a much greater respect for the work that goes into publishing a book. And as maybe simplistic as that sounds, there are a lot of moving parts or a lot of things to consider. There's a lot that happens in the journey of writing, and I didn't even actually write this book. Like, I almost feel in some ways it's not even mine. Like, so I feel like I just have so much more respect and appreciation for every published piece of writing that I notice anywhere. I just have a very different relationship to the work. There are probably other changes too, but that's what first comes to mind. Thank you for that beautiful reading, and I look forward to reading the whole thing in the New Quarterly, and thanks for your question. Did that answer your question? That was good? Okay, thanks. Okay, our next reader is Wayne Grady. Wayne Grady was born in Windsor, Ontario. His writing has appeared in such literary magazines as the Tamarack Review, Quarry, Event, and Queen's Quarterly. He has published 2 novels, Emancipation Day and Up from Freedom. He has taught creative nonfiction in the MFA program at the University of British Columbia and now divides his time between Kingston, Ontario and San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. Wayne's 3rd novel, The Good Father, will be published by Doubleday in the spring, and his translation of Yara El Gadbar's novel, I Am Ariel Sharon, is also being published by Anansi. So Wayne, welcome, and please introduce your reading. Is Wayne here? Wayne, I can't hear you. Are you on mute?
Okay, sorry, I'm back. Thank you, Kim, for the introduction. I'm going to read from my first novel, Emancipation Day, which was published in 2013. My wife jokes that I became a first novelist and a senior citizen in the same year. And I'm going, the novel takes place, part of the novel takes place in Windsor, and part of it takes place in St. John's, Newfoundland. And I'm going to read from early on in the novel, a part that takes place in St. John's. So the setup is that Jack Lewis, who is the main male character, is in the Navy. He's from Windsor. He's been transferred to St. John's. He's playing in the Navy band. He's in the Navy. He's playing in the Navy band, and they've formed a five-person combo that plays at dances in St. John's for the local people. Vivian Fanshawe is one of the local people who was at that dance. And she looks up on the stage and she sees Jack on the stage. If you didn't know better, if you forgot you were in the Knights of Columbus hostel in St. John's, Newfoundland, and if you squinted up at the stage through the smoke and the darkness and the dancing couples, well, you might think it was Frank Sinatra up there. But you'd have to wonder what Frank Sinatra was doing in St. John's looking like a lost kid. That was the difference. The real Frank Sinatra never looked lost. Since she was at the KFC dance as a volunteer, selling lunches to raise money for the war effort. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention this takes place in 1943. Raising money for the war effort. During the break, she took a tray of sandwiches and tea to the band in the back room. The King's Men, they called themselves. They were drinking beer, which wasn't allowed, but she didn't say anything. They were from the Navy band down at HMCS Avalon. She'd seen them many times parading back and forth from the base to the dockyards whenever a convoy sailed. They looked right smart in their dark blue uniforms with white puttees and dicky fronts, but St. John's was full of men from away, and a girl had to be careful. She served him last, when there were just the two halves left on the tray. By the time she got to him, she'd worked herself into a fine tizzy. She looked at her, he looked at her, and she felt caught. There was only the tray between them. He pointed at the sandwiches and said, "What kind are they?" "Fish," she said. "Mary Parsons made them, and she's Catholic." "What's that got to do with anything?" Mainlanders didn't know much, did they? "The fish is left over from last night," she said. "Friday," she added, when he looked at her blankly. "Leftover fish," he said, "and tea." He took a swig from his beer. "Just like home." From close up, he was handsome as all get out. His eyes seemed to pull her in, and she had trouble keeping the tray straight. He was a bit wound up. She could tell that. It might be from being on stage, but she hoped it was from being near her. He was tanned, like a fisherman. Maybe he came from somewhere warm. She sensed a need in him that she had liked, because she thought it was a need that she could fulfill. Everyone had needs, her parents, her sister, her younger brother, but satisfying their needs was something she had to do. She didn't have a choice in the matter. With this man, though, this stranger, she felt in her body that his were needs that she would be happy to look after. His woolen uniform had dark stains down the back, and his white dicky was soaked. She almost asked him if he wanted her to bring him a towel. "You eat a lot of fish where you come from, do you?" she said, surprised that her voice was still working. "Enough." "Where's it come from then?" she said. "From a can." "You mean from a tin?" "Yeah, from a tin can," he said. "How come your skin is so white? Don't you ever get any sun?" "This is Newfoundland, Mr. Lewis. Have you seen any sun lately?" She should have. "My name is Jack," he said, holding out his hand. There was an awkward moment as she shifted the tray to her left hand and shook his with her right. His felt cold and bony, as if she were shaking a frog. It didn't repel her, though. It told her that he was as nervous as she was. "I'll call you Jack Tar," she said. "That's a sailor, ain't it?" "Jack Tar, that's me." And he sang, "I was born upon the deep blue sea." He hadn't been, though, she thought. He hadn't been anywhere near the sea before, and she hadn't been anywhere else. "Well," she said, "if you don't want a sandwich." She began turning away. "Wait," he reached out and held his hand a few inches from her chest, pretending to be choosing a sandwich. "They both look so nice," he said, looking up at her and smiling into her eyes. "He thinks I'm a V girl," she thought. "Am I?" Her arms ached from holding the tray, but she couldn't move. She could feel the heat from his hand through her blouse. "What's your name?" he asked. "I'll never tell." "Come on, I bet I can guess." "Go ahead and try." "Lily White," he said. "No, it's Vivian Clift." It was only part of her name, but that was close enough. Finally, he looked down at her tray and took a sandwich. She almost stepped back as though he had let go of her. "Thanks for the grub, Vivian Clift. Got a song you like? I'll sing it for you next set." But she couldn't think of a song she liked. Couldn't think of any song at all, not even one she didn't like. Her mind was still on his hand and its heat. I'm not staying, she said. I've got to go home. Too bad, he said, biting into his sandwich. How much for the sandwich? It's on the house, she said. Thanks. He washed the sandwich down with the last of his beer. See you around then, Lily White. There.
Thank you, Wayne.
Thank you. I guess I have a quick question for you, Kim. What's your next project?
My thesis, my one enduring project.
Well, that's forever.
Oh, please let it not be so. Other than that, I am really looking forward to diving into some research material that I have from a trip to South Africa in 2017. And I'm not sure, I'm in a really beautiful, two beautiful book clubs, writing groups. One is creative nonfiction and the other is children's books. So I'm not really sure where it's going to go, but I look forward to getting there. Thank you. Okay, our next reader, Farzana Doctor. Farzana was born in Zambia to expatriate parents from India, immigrating to Canada with her family in the early 1970s. She has written 4 works of fiction: Stealing Nasreen, 6 Meters of Pavement, All Inclusive, and 7. She works as a registered social worker in a private psychotherapy practice. Farzana lives in Toronto, Ontario. Farzana, welcome.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you everybody who's put this event together. I'm going to be reading from 7, and I don't think I need to set up too much. I'm going to read a short piece from the protagonist Sharifa, and then I'll read from another section about Abdul Ali. This section is from 2015. In the evening, Mortaza and I meet on the couch for the married person's evening ritual, TV. Along with a nightly bowl of microwave popcorn, we've been putting away 2 episodes of The Mindy Project after Z is in bed. We guffaw and cringe in the same places. We are diasporic South Asian children of immigrants communing over the embarrassing life of a diasporic South Asian child of immigrants. While the credits roll, Mortaza leans over, kisses my neck, and says, "Shall we turn it off now or watch another episode?" "Sure, Murthy, we can turn it off," I say, sensing his preference. After all, it is Saturday and 9 p.m. I'd prefer to hit play, to be distracted by someone else's awkward world, but I appreciate my husband's good-natured and consistent initiative-taking. My friends and I talk about our lackluster sex lives and waning libidos, and I feel like I'm the lucky one amongst us. At least we can say we are still doing it, rather than being in couples therapy because we aren't, or breaking up because we aren't, or having extramarital affairs because we aren't. And this next bit I'm going to read is January 1866, and this takes place in South Bombay. 11-year-old Abdul Ali huddled under the yellow glow of a street lamp, his index finger pacing his labored reading. "The lion lives in the jungle," he whispered. "His roar is loud." An elderly fruit seller trudged by with an empty wooden cart pulled by a weary bullock. Just in time, Abdul Ali wrapped his legs around the post to avoid a heavy hoof landing on his toe. A fly, one of the bullock's many-winged passengers, hopped onto his hand and then onto the Hindi primary reader he had borrowed from Sunil, the 9-year-old boy of the family for whom he worked. He told his mother it was a gift. Did she believe the lie? Thinking of her, it seemed, could summon her. He looked up and saw her face framed in the window of the 3rd-floor room they shared with another widow and her 3 young children. She fanned herself with her orna. Despite the evening's cool, the day's heat lingered in their room. He waved to her and pleaded, "5 more minutes, Mummy?" She nodded, her lips a straight line. But he knew she was proud of him, knew they had left the village for a better life, and for now, their better life was just this one nicked book about a lion in a jungle that he struggled, word by word, to understand. Thanks. So I have so many questions after reading this. So let me ask, Kim, was there any experience or perspective that you really wanted to include, but just weren't able to? These are the kinds of things that keep me up at night. And so I'm wondering if you thought about any perspective or experience that didn't get in there.
Thank you. What a great question. It's a tough one to answer. Yeah, especially, well, actually, I guess I'll just point everyone to, oh, first of all, thanks for the great readings. I love your book, by the way. Love it, love it. And it's giving me ideas for my own work about South Africa, so thank you. There's a bibliography, a really, like an annotated bibliography in the back of this book. And there are three pieces written by Casey Plett that are amazing. And I really did my best to reach out to some trans authors that are phenomenal, but like most marginalized authors who we might know of, so stretched in the demands on their time and the demands on their energy. And they were so gracious and encouraging. And Casey was kind enough to send me some work. And when I read through her work, it was just really wonderful. And I was like, oh, can we have like an additional section and just republish them, get some permission and republish them. And so they're in the bibliography. So that would be one answer. I had a great conversation with Dr. Cecil Foster. He's a sociology professor, retired from the University of Guelph. And now, and he was so gracious and really thoughtful. So he kind of blew my mind when we were talking together, but his interview didn't end up in the pages. It's quite a hefty book. And we were able to include 2 appendices that I thought were super important. And all these choices and all these decisions took a lot of consultation, right? So, I really appreciate your question. Obviously, it's not intended to be comprehensive. It's that ongoing conversation that hopefully, I think we might have mentioned it in the intro, that hopefully a door is propped open for it to continue, and that we realize that these kinds of conversations have value, and when we engage in them with thoughtfulness and true curiosity and maybe some humility and openness to learning with each other, that it can be valuable. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh my goodness. Okay. Our next reader is Arif Anwar. Arif is an author, professor, and an international development professional and technology expert. His first novel, The Storm, was critically acclaimed by the New York Times and published in multiple languages. Arif's work has appeared in the Daily Beast, Vice Magazine, Electric Literature, Dhaka Tribune, and the Daily Star. He has also authored and co-authored a number of academic works. Arif has worked for BRAC, the world's largest NGO. Based in Bangladesh, BRAC works on issues of poverty alleviation, including microcredit, education, public health, and agriculture. Currently, Arif is working on his second novel and a short story collection while working as an instructor at the University of Toronto and adjunct professor at Notre Dame de Namur University in California. Arif lives in Toronto. Welcome, Arif.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to read from The Storm, my debut novel, and by definition, my finest work. So I'm going to read from a section where the protagonist, Sharyar, who's a foreign student in Washington, D.C., starts dating Valerie, who is American. So it's from his perspective. The following week, they go to see 4 weddings and a funeral at Lowe's at Waterfront. Later, walking up an alley and before late-night kebabs at Moby Dick, they kiss on a bridge over the canals. They spend weekends walking from one end of the vast Smithsonian network to the other, browsing the outdoor stalls at Eastern Market, where he buys for her a shawl of gold brocade on blue, amusing her by demonstrating the stylish way men wrap them around their shoulders in Bangladesh. After she makes him excavate the Bangla book stored in a trunk in his closet, they spend an afternoon drinking milk tea as he helps her trace the characters on parchment paper, spelling her name in his native letters, practicing until the shaky pencil outlines gain the thickness of confidence, and they must switch the lights on to continue. During their courtship, he worries about things he cannot control. Disapproval that he spots in the eyes of shopkeepers and pedestrians, minute scowls or the tiny bending back of lips at the sight of them holding hands or kissing. Often so brief and subtle, he wonders if he is imagining it. She tells him of her Indian boyfriend, the son of the head of a local NGO, whom she met while volunteering for flood relief over the course of several rainy afternoons. Their romance was brief, covert, and ended when she left India. But stored in a shoebox in her closet, she keeps photographs of the two of them. Seeing these, Shar feels jealous that Val was once so close to someone who, at least superficially, resembles him. In these early days, the canvas of their relationship is a blameless white, but as the weeks and months pass, he begins to sketch on them dark and troubled visions of how his parents might receive the news of him dating a foreigner. He summons himself to the witness box to testify to his motives for dating Val. Are his feelings genuine or merely fueled by the thrill of dating an American? His imaginary prosecutor poses the same questions to Val, asking whether Shar is the understudy, a paler stand-in for the man she left behind in India, the one she really loves. When they sleep together, the indecency of the act, his lifestyle in this new country, inculcated in him through a lifetime of steeping in the amorphous brand of Islamic morality that permeates his homeland, overwhelms the sense of intimacy and love that it should engender. He confesses these fears to her, including his concern about the fate of their relationship once his program at Georgetown ends. Her response, that they will cross that bridge when they come to it, he finds less than reassuring. She seems to be standing still, so he runs closer to her instead. One night, he tells her of a dream he has had since childhood, of waking in a hut, the sunlight shining through many blazing apertures in the thatch roof, playing with chickens in a dirt courtyard, his feet nestled in the hot sand of an unnamed beach, holding the hand of a woman whose dark skin makes the green of her eyes starker still. That is a strange dream, she says. How many times have you had it? Too many to count. They are lying in bed. A feeble July breeze crawls through the window of her Tenley-town efficiency. The sheets stick to their backs. Maybe it's from something you read once, a movie you saw. No, he shakes his head, unable to find the words to express that this dream, like that of him running to escape a storm, does not feel imagined, the product of a mind alone. They are relics washed up on the shores of his being. That's it for me for now.
Thank you, Arif. Wonderful.
So my question is a two-parter, Kim. It would be, who is your favorite author in this book, and why was it me? No, I'm kidding.
It's because you offered your best work.
There you go. No, I think my question would be, who do you envision sort of reading this book? Did you have an ideal reader, or did you have a reader in mind?
Yeah, great question. Actually, a few of you have asked questions that I have on my list to ask you later. So it's interesting. To be honest, I was very selfishly indulging in these conversations for myself. and I think that might be self-evident as you read through the conversations. I really felt it important as part of this process to just be very sincere, to be authentic, and to be curious, and to trust the process and trust the conversations. So that just resulted in me asking questions right from my heart. Yeah, so did I have anyone in mind? I guess I did also consider the fact that this was intended to be published. So I was trying to keep in mind that this could be really for anyone who was curious about the topic. And so I guess as much as I was able, I was trying to have a broad perspective, but of course I'm very limited. So I guess people like me, a cisgendered woman, middle-class neighborhood in Ontario, who's learning how to write, maybe, I don't know. Maybe that's as much as I could do. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Thank you for sharing your work. Okay, our next reader and our final reader before our Q&A. So everyone, I hope you're thinking of your questions and answers to put in the chat, is Angie Abdou. Angie holds a PhD in creative writing from the University of Calgary and has published 7 books. Her first novel, The Bone Cage, was a finalist for Canada Reads 2011. Her most recent novel, In Case I Go, was a finalist for the 2017 Banff Mountain Book Award in the fiction and poetry category. Angie's newest book is a memoir called Home Ice: Reflections of a Reluctant Hockey Mom. Angie Abdou is an associate professor of creative writing at Athabasca University. Welcome, Angie.
Thank you, Kim, and thanks to Kim and Luke for including me in this collection. And I'm going to talk about In Case I Go. This novel was grew out of my own family history, me wanting to explore that. And my grandfather is from Syria. He moved to Canada when he was 12 years old, to work in coal mines. His first wife was Lakota, and he had 3 children in that marriage. My Aunt Amy is the only one still alive. She's in her 90s, and she says, I'm a new breed. She's half Lakota, half Syrian, so an unusual combination. And then that Lakota wife left my grandfather, and he married my grandmother, who's Austrian. So he had 2 more kids who are Austrian Syrian. And when we get together in family reunions, there is Lakota, Cree, Austrian Syrian, a real mix of ethnicities. And I look at all these children and I think, wow, this generation does not have an easy road set out for it. There are so many challenges in terms of the environment, the mess we've made of it, in terms of trying to move forward in this country from the horrible history of genocide. And I see these young children and I think they're really living their lives in answer to their ancestors' mistakes. They're going to have to find solutions to these horrible mistakes that weren't theirs. And so I wrote this book. The young character, Eli, is Syrian, looks white, and his neighbor, Mary, is indigenous, and they are haunted by their ancestors. They become possessed by their own past and their own ancestors. So I'm going to read a little page, 2 pages, that shows Mary and Eli, and you'll get a sense of the fluidity in history. Eli is just starting to figure out that Mary is not just his neighbor girl next door, and he's starting to figure out that he's also not just Eli, and he's been following Mary up a mountain. She's much stronger than he is. Come on, slowpoke, Mary says into the strong wind. We're almost there. She tugs on my arm, and we push through some dense underbush. Twigs scratch my arms and neck and face. I know I will be a mess of wounds if I ever get home to my mom. I'm about to complain. Enough, Mary, I want to go home. But then we come out on a flat bench of the mountain, a green clearing filled with wild daisies. I recognize this place. In the center of that familiar field stands a copse of trees. It looks planted, too precise, too orderly to be natural. The trees make an almost perfect ring. Nature doesn't do that. In the middle of the circle of trees, I see a grand stone. I recognize it right away as a tombstone. A grave comes as no surprise in this neighborhood. This pretty clearing makes a nice spot to remember a special person. A family has put some thought into this grave, even if it is hard to get to. Mary watches me waiting, and I know there's more for me to discover. I'm cold, and I've eaten nothing today except half a bowl of oatmeal with some wild berries. I haven't seen Mary eat at all. I want to go home where my mom will warm and feed me, even if she scolds me first. I would take the scolding. The dark clouds move quickly across the sky now and send shadows scattering across Mary's face. In this light, I see a new sharpness in her cheekbones and a hollowness under her eyes. Suddenly she wears the face of a woman, not a child. She looks hungry. The yellow fabric of her dress pulls tightly across her breasts. My mom says never to call them boobies, adult names for adult body parts. It hurts to look at Mary. I round the stone and read. Mary, 1902 to 1920, much loved. I'm cut loose, falling, and there's no ground. I reach for the tombstone to steady myself against it, but then I don't want to touch it. I know this stone. Mary sits down in the long grass and pulls daisies from the ground, tucks one behind each ear. She picks another and leaves the long stem attached. I watch her use it to tie her hair back. I try to steady my vision on her, on my friend Mary, but she blurs and spins. There are 2 of her, and then there are 6. I close my eyes tightly. I am Eli Mountain. My mom is Lucy, a medievalist. My dad is Nicholas, an environmental scientist who works at a coal mine. I am Eli Mountain. I am 10 years old, 10, a number to hold on to with each hand. I do want to stay. Mary picks up a small pebble and lobs it at the tombstone. Her throw is not fierce. The pebble bounces off the stone and lands lightly in the grass. Even on my gravestone, she says, they always called me Mary. Even there, he could not acknowledge that Mary was not my name. She runs her hands the length of her legs, but not as if she's cold. It's about power, she says. They name you, they know you. More than that, they name you, they own you. Rain begins to fall. I shiver, but Mary has no goosebumps on her bare arms. You couldn't stop either. You always called me Mary, until the very end. What do you want? I hear her say, though her lips don't move. The same or different? Okay.
Thank you, Angie. Powerful. Do you have a question for me? You don't have to.
Sorry, no, I do have a question. I'm nervous. I usually go first when I'm reading because of my last name. And so I'm so used to going and then not being nervous. And so listening to everybody, I was like, well, you have time to build nerves. So thank you. I do have a question. I've always wondered since this book came out, or even since our first conversation, is did you have an idea about cultural appropriation in novels that changed after the interviews? Like, did you have something that you thought, this is for sure what I think, and this is for sure is what is right, and then you talked to all of us and changed that idea?
That's a great question. My ideas definitely changed from the beginning to the end. I'm not sure I had a fully formed idea of what it was at the beginning. I think that was part of the process of engaging in the conversations, if that makes any sense. I think when it was such an intense kind of blow up with the resignation of Hal Nidveski from the Writers Union publication in 2017, and when the Cultural Appropriation Prize issue, like so many issues in 2020 and just recently, like they're just kind of really coming to the surface, right? Like it's when it came to the surface like that, and then it was picked up even internationally, I guess I woke up a little bit because it surprised me, because I was new to the writing community, taking courses at the University of Guelph, and it wasn't as relevant before that, I think, to me. And then conversations with Jeremy made it even more central, I think, in my mind. So I didn't have a fully formed idea at the beginning. And it was kind of starting to form amid the crucible of this intensity and this social upheaval. So my thinking, I think, evolved. And now, to be honest, I reread Daniel Heath Justice's intro yesterday. And it's such a beautifully written essay. I feel like it contributes so much value to this publication, that I would imagine that the more I go back and the more I reread that essay and look at the resources in the bibliography and look at UNDRIP and consider how it affects my life every day, that it's going to continue to evolve. So does that, I wasn't trying to skirt the question. I'm not sure about specific, yeah.
I think that's interesting, even to know that you came into it with an open mind and not looking for answers rather than thinking you already had them is interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And maybe it was just naivete, and maybe that's why I said yes to the project. I remember, Arif, you were saying that too, that, you know, with your novel, with Storm, you had the naivete to say, yeah, I can write a novel, I'll just write one. And look at how successful it was.
Little
So
knowledge is a dangerous thing.
yes, so thanks for that question, Angie. Okay, I have a few questions for you. And Vanessa has kindly invited everyone in our listening audience to share questions in the chat. So please think about that and ask questions, I'd like to begin, Farzana, this time when Hal did resign from the Writers Union, you were working on the equity task force at the time. And in the piece in the book, in our conversation, you talked about the work being mostly about representation of diverse voices. And I'm wondering if the work has evolved beyond that, or if you see it moving beyond that.
When I read all of these interviews, I felt like it was moving beyond that. Like, I think about, Jael talking about economic disparities, like who gets published and why, who's telling the stories and why. So it's about representation, but it's about a few more things than that. I also really liked Daniel Heath Justice's essay. One of the pieces that I really took from that is rights versus responsibilities. Many people have said through this book, no one can tell you what to write or what not to write. That's up to you, but then you have to kind of weigh, what is your responsibility to your own communities, to the world, and so on. What are your ethical responsibilities? So I think it has moved. At the time when all of that was happening with Write magazine, there's a little bit of context that might be useful. The Writers Union of Canada is, like any organization, it's an organization that has a lot of work to do in terms of making change, in terms of, just having, more members from more diverse groups. This is a problem that has been long discussed, decades and decades, right? And so I got involved with the union a number of years ago, and we were starting to make some progress. Like, it felt like there were some hopeful changes. And so there was this deep distress and deep disappointment when this issue of Right came out with Hal's piece in it, talking about the Appropriation Prize. It just felt like, all of this work didn't matter. Like, that was sort of what was happening. And so our task force got busy very quickly. We organized very quickly to try to think about what was our response going to be. We didn't want to be hasty, but we had to be quick at the same time. And so we really used it, I think, to push the Writers Union membership to approve a lot of things that needed to have happened already. And that was what was so useful about that moment for this equity task force. It was we could be really strategic because this was going international, So I don't know if I answered your question fully. There were so many things that popped into my head as you even talked about Right. So many memories.
I'm sure. Well, I'm glad you called the memories and not like harmful flashbacks. So that's great.
They don't keep me up at night.
So
but,
that was
one thing I just want to mention that I really got from this book is that it isn't possible for us not to appropriate someone else's voice. It just is. It's not possible. We come from, intersectional experiences, and if we only are going to write about our own if we're going to write memoir, fine, we're not going to appropriate someone else's voice. But if we're going to write anything else about any other experience, we will. And so it's more a question of How do we do that well, with respect, with love, with kindness, with something that brings something good to the world?
Yeah, I think that was one thread that was in common, I think, through all of the conversations, that, you know, everyone can write, you can write what you want to write. And there are consequences, and there are rights, and there are responsibilities. And, but it is possible to leave it at that sort of vague and superficial level, or it's possible also to really dig into it and to see where we stand, considering those consequences. So yeah, I appreciate that, because fiction is fiction, right? And then there's genre fiction. Like there are so many different, like speculative fiction and genre fiction. Like there are just so many other places where imagination is so important. But you are talking about a crisis point. You called it a crisis point, I think, that moment in the history of Right magazine, and that many supporters in that moment threatened to resign from the union. And I'm wondering if you've noticed any noticeable shift in memberships in the Writers Union since then, because it's been a while. It's been a few years.
Yeah, yeah. You know, there was a deep dissatisfaction amongst BIPOC folks with the union for a long time, and you know, I was part of the can't remember what it's called, the National Committee, for a little while, and so I would try to encourage BIPOC people to join, and they would say, like, why would I join that organization? And I would give all kinds of reasons why I thought it was a good idea, but I wasn't very effective, I think. And so when this crisis point happened, a lot of BIPOC people were like, last straw. And so, but people stayed, because that crisis did, you know, become a good moment, I think, for the union in terms of making some shifts. I don't know about where things are at now. I'm less involved. I'm still on the equity task force, but I don't know if the maybe another union member here could speak to that if they have an idea of how the demographics have shifted or not. It's very slow to make these changes.
Can I respond to Valerie's question in the chat? What people are thinking about that? Valerie asked, she said, some of the people here are professors of creative writing. What do they say to their students about cultural appropriation? And so I teach creative writing. That's my day job. And I make them aware, I define cultural appropriation, and I make them aware of some of the controversies that have gone on in Canada. And so I just say, if you're going to write about difference, especially from a place of historical power, it's really important to do so sensitively and with great awareness, and preferably consultation. And I tell them about a writer, Colin McCann, an Irish writer who a lot of you probably know. He's a star. He has an organization, I think it's called Narrative 4, and he brings kids together. He makes an argument similar to one I've made, that novel writing is an act of radical empathy, and part of the value of fiction is that as a reader you can imagine yourself into the space of other people, and as a writer you imagine yourself into the place of very different people, and it would be a shame to lose that empathy because we're being so careful around issues of cultural appropriation. So it's this fine balance. And so in Colin McCann's thing, he brings kids together who are very different, like maybe inner city kids and rural kids, or Democrats and Republicans, or differences based on race. And he has them tell each other their stories, and then they write the other person's story, but they have to keep going back to the group and sharing their stories and saying, did I get it right? So that they can try to tell the other person's story, but a real responsibility comes with that. And it's really important to get it right. And so I like that, and that doesn't answer all the questions. It's still very challenging, and even once you do that consultation, it definitely doesn't save you from criticism or from controversy. And in that way, I think the role of a fiction writer is changing, and for the better. I mean, it's good to have responsibility and to be held accountable. And so when I'm teaching students, I make them aware of what cultural appropriation is. I make them aware of some of the controversies. I share the story about Colin McCann, and then in their own writing, I'll draw attention to, like, are you sure this is right? Have you checked in with someone from this class or this race or this, whatever the point of difference might be? and I draw their attention to those spots where more research might be needed or some consultation might be needed, or where they're treading in really sensitive ground. And I let them know this conversation is ongoing, as Kim and Farzana said.
Thanks. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I'll talk about this. And I think as I look through the book, some of the things that people have said, I see a lot of echoes around the same sort of agreements or themes sort of emerge from everyone, is that it's not a light switch, as in, yes, you may write whatever you want or don't write anything. It's like a slider, it's a dimmer, it's a spectrum on which these sort of permissions, if you will, exist. I think the reason we're even having this conversation is because there are fundamental inequities in the world of publishing. If people who look like a lot of the authors who are on this panel had the exact same probabilities of getting published widely as a white or mainstream author, we wouldn't be having this conversation about appropriation. The appropriation conversation becomes relevant when you write from someone's perspective, and if there's the danger of either misrepresenting them or denigrating them, or maybe even depriving someone of an opportunity of being published. I can tell you one story of when my novel was going out into the world through my literary agents. We put the novel, as I say, on submission first in Canada. Usually the way some of the authors are familiar with it, the way it works is that you'll sell North American rights, as in the US will buy both the Canadian rights and the US rights for a novel. But since I was Canadian, my agent said, we'll first sell the rights in Canada, then we'll go to the States and we'll sell it in the States, build up some nice momentum and whatnot. So we submitted in Canada. Canada, everyone loved it. Several big publishers wanted it at the same time. There was an auction. Then we said, okay, great. So maybe this portends well for the US market. So we put the book on submission in the US market, and there was interest. And then at one point, this one large publisher, very well-known publisher, this editor at this well-known publisher said something to the effect of, oh, we really liked Arif's novel, but then my sales department reminded me that we have another book with Bangladeshi characters coming out this season. So it's going to be a no for us. So you sort of see how diversity, quote unquote, diversity has become commoditized and tokenized in the publishing profession. And I looked at the other book that the publisher was putting out that season with Bangladeshi characters, and it was as different from my book as you can imagine. It's like saying we can't publish Atonement and Bridget Jones' Diary at the same time because they both have British characters in it, right? No publisher would ever say that, because those works are not being defined by the ethnicities of the protagonist. And I looked at the woman who wrote the other book with Bangladeshi characters, and she wasn't Bengali or Bangladeshi, but she was married to someone of a Bengali background. And I thought, I'm still glad she got published, and I'm even glad that she got picked up over me, because I don't want that world where someone is told that you can't write this character or someone from this background. But I think that's an example of the fundamental inequities of the publishing world that exist, and some of the real world impacts that can happen when you choose, when you write a certain character, when you aren't thoughtful about it. So I think all the writers here agree is that you can write what you want, but just to be a little more cognizant of the wider context of the publishing world, and be mindful of what effect you might have on it. And that's just beyond even the sort of sensitivity readings and what else that comes with writing. But for writing difference, I think I do encourage my students to do it as a professor of creative writing. The American writer Alexander Chee has written, I think, sort of the best guideline, if you will, on writing different. Some of the things you can sort of checklist, like, have I engaged with this community? Have I read books from authors from this community? That I think is very comprehensive. So that's one thing to look at.
Arif, I just wanted to say that I think I do understand these issues about context that you're talking about that are so important. I understand them a lot better than I did in 2017 when my book came out.
Yeah.
And so I ended up in a controversy because Mary is Tanaka, which is, I live in the traditional territory of the Tanaka. And when the book came out, I totally understandably now, some Tanaka people said, like, who the heck's this white woman? Like, nobody even's heard of us, and now there's this white chick talking about us. I mean, I'm oversimplifying, but I understand that reaction so much better than I did then. And there are great Tanaka writers, Smokey Sumac, Troy Sebastian, and people can find those writers, and I can see why their first response was like, who the heck is Angie Abdou, and what right does she have to talk about us? I really get that, and which I didn't then. And there was also, I know some people sort of thought, well, oh, suddenly writing about Indigenous issues is hot, so everybody's going to jump on the bandwagon and write about Indigenous issues and profit from our pain and from this sudden interest. And that's not the way I approach novel writing. I mean, if I did, maybe I would have sold more books by now. I write totally out of personal trouble that I'm trying to understand. And this is a very personal story for me, but I 100% understand that reaction. So there's so much to consider, like all of you have said.
I also think that the kind of response, Eric's comment about getting it right, knowing the characters, doing the research. Have you been to that community? Do you know someone? We should do that with every character in every book. It doesn't matter what that character is. I mean, my next novel part of it takes place in Vancouver. The novel I just read from, part of it takes place in St. John's. I would not have used those locations even, let alone the characters, had I not been very familiar with those locations, because you just don't want to get it wrong for ethical reasons, but also for practical reasons. You get it wrong, people are going to realize you got it wrong, and it's going to affect the way they read the book. So I just think the responsibility, we're talking about rights and responsibilities. That's one of, yes, we have the right to write what we need to write, what is coming out that we need to write, but we also have the responsibility to get it right. And we have the responsibility not just to our community, but to literature to get it right.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in here. Thank you. These are very thoughtful responses. Kashire asked a really beautiful question in the chat, but before we head to that question, I wanted to just refer to a couple of comments. In Mahak's piece in the book, she says that writers need to stop pretending they're living in a void and entitled to do whatever they want, and treat this world as their playground. And it's about what it means to be human. And I think that's why this is so complex, because it really is that deep, right? It's about our humanness. And Sanchari, her PhD dissertation is about the representation of 4 subaltern bodies in the work of South Asian authors, I believe. So Sanchari, I just have a question for you. I wonder if you could address it sort of in preparation for answering and fielding Kashire's question in the chat. The representation of these 4 subaltern bodies, you describe it in your PhD work as a challenge of the idea of happy multiculturalism in Canada. How so?
Oh, basically I said these representations are challenging the idea of happy multiculturalism. So the 4 subaltern bodies that I have identified are the representation of disabled bodies, the trans body, or the gender ambiguous body, the Muslim body, and also the person who's passed away, the dead, which is what subaltern really is if you've read Spivak's essay. There is an idea that Canadian multiculturalism is like this. I mean, Canada itself is this utopic space for immigrants, right? Because it unites everybody under this big multicultural umbrella. And that's problematic. I mean, there have been critiques of this as well, because it erases all the the intersectional identities of all the people who live here. And I just don't mean immigrants, I also mean refugees, I mean Indigenous people, I mean Black people. These are very complicated histories as well that go along with them. But there seems to be an overarching understanding that this idea of being Canadian is also largely white. That's the kind of value system that seems to be attached to the idea of being Canadian, or what a good Canadian really is. And the works that I'm looking at, which are of works by South Asian Canadian women, one of them is Farzana's work as well. Basically, the representations that they have done of these subaltern bodies in their works, it does question that idea of happiness, because when a certain person can't fit into Canada, right? And I'm only looking at literature, but even literature is representation of real world, reflection of the real world, lived realities. It shouldn't be seen as a failure of the character or the failure of the person to not fit in. It is really the failure of Canadian multicultural state. I mean, Canadian multiculturalism is very different from US multiculturalism as well. We don't really have what it means to be Canadian identity, which is, I think in US, people seem to have that national pride much more because that identity is very different. But the way multiculturalism is used in Canada by the Canadian state, it's extremely problematic. So I think these representations and these works are challenging that idea. So what really is happiness, and happiness for whom? Who is the happy citizen, right? Those are the kind of questions that I'm looking at.
Thank you so much, because I know, like, with the very limited experience I have in publishing some of my work, I did feel a little uncomfortable in feeling that my story was, you know, kind of dipping into the exoticized stories that I might have to offer, thinking that that's the most marketable. As a person of color, I have so many stories, but to me it felt like, well, if I want to get published, if I want people to really want to read this, I should really have something, I think somebody called it like almost like sensational sort of immigrant porn. I don't know if that, I don't mean to offend anyone by that term, but so I did have a little bit of a sense of that. And so I appreciate what you're working on. And I just wanted to read out this question in the chat. It's from Kashayar Mohammadi to everyone. I have found that many times various memoirs and tales of human rights violations in their country of origin or ancestral country is turned into a tool for those in power to promote hate speech toward ethnicities. Example, the US using first-generation Muslim immigrants' voices as arguments in Islamophobia, or using such arguments for propaganda to promote military presence. I was wondering if anyone had any thoughts about that or a response.
Kim, sorry, before you answer that question, I noticed Dale asked, what is the definition of cultural appropriation? And maybe that's really important for the foundation of all these questions. So if you could just answer that before we go to the more advanced question. Just what is cultural appropriation?
Okay, sure. If everyone can scroll on their chat to Kashayar's question, you might need to read that to fully understand. It's a very complex question. Thanks, Angie. So Dale, cultural appropriation, well, you'll see in the first essay by Daniel Heath Justice that he studies this and he's much more intelligent and well-versed about this than I am. But he says there's no consensus about its definition or its terms. And too often when it enters broader conversation, it's in a simplistic and a reductive way. So I just want to make that caveat. But basically it's about taking someone else's culture, stories, traditions, and using them for your own benefit when you are not from that culture, or you are not from, it's not yours, but you've taken it and used it for profit, and you've used it for your own gain, perhaps not with any consideration about what the impact might have on the culture where it's come from. Is that fair enough to say? If anyone has anything to add to that. No? Okay. So hopefully, Dale, that's helpful. Okay, so Kashayar's question. That's a really great question. And I think it also speaks to what Arif was saying about the limited number of stories there are available about various cultures. I mean, Ian Williams in his section of the book also refers to that, right? He talks about Black authors in Canada. And he's like, you could probably name them, right? And he says that it seems like the industry has room for maybe 3 of them at a time. And it's like, as soon as you can name 3 or 5, it's like, okay, but we've got Black writers. And it's so strange because there's just there's so many white writers, they're uncountable. So I think that's a fair question. And then with Kashire's question about the content of those stories and how it might be then used to promote oppression. Does anyone have any thoughts about that?
I have so many thoughts about that. Okay.
Please go ahead.
So if I may, with your kind permission, if I may talk about sort of the publishing literary awards complex, if it exists, whose intention often seems to herd, if I may use the term writers of color, I'm not a fan, writers of color into continually mining our historical trauma and quote unquote immigrant narratives, so that we are in a Pavlovian way conditioned to produce a certain kind of story where we're essentially, profanity alert, are being asked to tell people how shitty our lives are, right? So problematize your societies, criticize your societies, why is it so bad? So in a way, we're still being patronized and pitied. So the stories are still the same. The protagonists are defined in a relational way, as in, what is your immigration status to this country that you're writing about? So when you're talking about protagonists in that relational way in terms of their legal status in a country, the protagonist is no longer the protagonist of the story. The protagonist of the story becomes America or Canada or the UK. And all the writers get herded into producing a limited types of stories. So at the fundamental level, diversity of writers must begin with the different types of faces that you see at the in the book covers, in the author pages, and the author picture pages. But have we really branched out into offering different types of narratives that don't problematize, that are not trauma narratives? Maybe that's starting to change. That's why I get excited to see someone like Uzma Jalaluddin's book, Aisha at Last, or that book, Crazy Rich Asians, because these are presenting people of color in sort of different suits and different narratives than the one that we're used to. So the implication still seems to be that to win a big award, you must tell us about how terrible your lives are. And that is something I really, really feel a fundamental repulsion towards. So Kashire's story is, Kashire's question is a very valid one, is are we reinforcing these stereotypes? Because those are the things we keep writing about. If we keep talking about the reluctant fundamentalist, then we are reinforcing these stereotypes and these narratives. And that worries me a lot.
Thank you, Arif. Well said. I'm just noticing, Mahak, you've been very quiet, and I have some questions for you as well. Mahak, in your piece, you also shared so much about how this is about assessing benefit, right? And who benefits? Who benefits throughout the system? Like, we're talking about a system here that's supporting what Arif is talking about. And so I'm curious about that. And also, we know that advertisements and marketing work. These organizations have the ability to influence what readers read and what they become interested in. So if we take this book, for example, Inappropriate, as our study and our case study in point, what kind of pitch would we give to these folks to say, hey, choose this, promote this? How do you think we could pitch this book?
You mean how could the publisher pitch this book? Is that the question?
Yes, how could the publisher pitch the book?
I feel like that's way outside of my ability to answer the question exactly in terms of my expertise. But I guess it's a question about how do you get readers interested in the topic to begin with, or interested in engaging with the subject, or how do you get the literary community to engage with the subject, and so on. I feel like we're in a time period where we're under this false, we're presented to us this false impression that as individuals we're in control over these really big things, that as individuals, if we recycle every day, we will be able to stop climate change. Or if we ourselves read works by, like as individuals, buy books by writers who are not only of a certain background, we will somehow rectify whatever inequities there are in the world. So this is not at all something that I talked about at the time that we had that interview, or not even just, they're just developing thoughts. But right now it seems to me, in the space of this topic, of this idea of appropriation, and you quoted what I said earlier, how writers need to stop pretending they're in the void. But even I myself, what I did in that statement is I made it seem as if the writer is somehow entirely responsible for rectifying this situation of appropriation, when, you know, Arif's example really demonstrates, and actually all research shows, that the biggest influencer in reader sales or getting readers interested in a book is the publisher. This whole idea of like writers need to market themselves more and so on, all research shows that writers can barely do anything. It's just like a drop. It's just a fantasy. And I think it's just an excuse to get the bigger publishers, really, is what we're talking about here, to get them to not do as much, or make it look like the author didn't do much, when, you know, again, all the research shows that it's really the publisher that determines everything. So I feel like I don't know what I could say about our small community, what we're doing here, because I feel like we're doing what can be done in our sort of sphere, but really I'm now more and more starting to think that all of this burden is on writers, who are really, in the scheme of publishing, the weakest link in the scheme of publishing, when really our attention should be forced, or should be on the people who are kind of hiding from attention, which is sales and marketing, and again, speaking to the question that was asked in the chat about how these books are released on this individual experience that somebody has had, maybe a traumatic experience, but then those books become tools for further oppression. It really just goes to speak how they're being positioned that way, probably by sales and marketing, and then entering into a community that sees themselves as, oh, these are serving us. And to that I include every person in that, not just people who might be in control, so to speak, but we're all conditioned to participate in this. So I'm very, just lately, more and more moving forward, thinking about systems and forces and stuff. I'm very, very suspicious when anything tries to make it an individual responsibility, or the individual of the responsibility of very few, when most of change, good change in society, happens by making a big change at a large scale in a very thorough way. That's going to have the most impact. I don't know if that really answered the question, but
that's a great response.
Yeah.
And it connects, Sanchari has said, you know, the gatekeepers have to be, what was the word that you used? Interrogated. And that it reminds me of a point that Wayne made. And Wayne, in your piece, you were talking about how the confidence that the editors placed in you gave you freedom to develop as a writer. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, like, yeah, I mean, you're welcome to speak to that, but I'm curious about, where do I find an editor like that for me?
Well, you know, I was talking about my editor for the first novel. It was my first novel, but it was actually my 16th book. I had written a lot of nonfiction, creative nonfiction, and nature and science writing before that. So I had a track record. I had a reputation. And when the editors came to me, when I brought this book to my editors, they already knew I had readers, so they said go ahead and do, you know, they trusted that they knew that I was going to write something that was going to be okay. So they kind of let me go, and you know, there was a lot of editing. I mean, it was my first novel, and you know, we can talk for the next 5 days about the, you know, switching from writing nonfiction to fiction and how difficult that is. But I did have a certain track record that they knew about, and so it was okay. I mean, it was yeah, I think that's where that came from, that the editors sort of knew what, I mean, I've been a magazine editor. I had been a magazine editor for a long time, and you know, when a writer that you know has done a lot of work for you comes to you with an idea, a new idea for a story, it may be an idea that has never occurred to you before, or you never would have thought to have assigned, but because the writer, you know, the writer who's proposing it has done good work for you before, then you sort of more likely to say, go ahead and yes, and do it. Yes, go ahead and do it. And so that's what happened in this case.
Thank you. Yeah, it's talking a lot about trust and
yeah,
trust within the system. And it's curious to me too, Farzana in her work mentioned this experience she had of reading about a Muslim secondary character named Krishna in a book. So this, which is just kind of laughable and sad, but it's just kind of pointing to careless, unskilled writing. And because it's kind of saying in Farzana's words, this character doesn't matter, I'm just dappling a little color because I'm supposed to be writing diversity. And to me, my question also when I reread that experience was, where were the editors in that process as well? Like, it's not just the writer. But then again, this idea, I agree with this idea that systemic issues need a systemic resolution, and it can't just be put on any individual. Olga in the chat shares that she's just completed a book about the Giller Prize and has tracked the winning and nominated books over the past 26 years, and there's a great deal more diversity now, which is really, really great. Is that the kind of systemic change? I mean, again, that's still a point in a system, right? That's one thing, but has it made a big difference, do you think?
I think for me, it won't feel like we've really moved on until we stop talking about it. Like, it just needs to be diverse in the way that we describe diverse, and we don't need to have a conversation about it where we gather in a room and are just, because all it does, at least for me, is make me feel like a sore thumb sticking out all the time. You know what I mean? And it's just like, I really don't want to be that. I just, like any person, I have my own idiosyncrasies and bad habits, and I'm very human. And I want to be my very human self rather than this radiant, diverse individual. You know, I just really want to stop being that. And I feel like these conversations are, which right now, of course, are necessary. Obviously, that's why I'm participating in this. But I feel like we haven't, as it's wonderful to do the statistics and recognize the numbers and all of that. But I think to equate that with any kind of, there's still a lot of work. I think any person who is experiencing that in the, like, trying to figure out how to find their place can speak to that. But it is a lot more than just the representation of the awards, especially because of earlier, you know, pointing out that people end up naming, say, 3 or 5 whatever writers, and they're like, we're done because look, we have it, and it exists. Whereas not really interrogating, well, you know, it's not really as commonplace as you think.
Thank you for that. And Wayne, I also wanted to ask you about your work in translation. Do any of these sort of concerns also ripple into that work? Because that's a very interesting and valuable element of the publishing industry, is translation.
Yeah, it does come up in translation, because you really, the whole question of voice, for one thing, you're translating someone else's voice, and the question is, do you translate into your own voice, or do you try to preserve the original writer's voice? And of course that raises all kinds of ethical questions. There's also the question about translating culture. I mean, you get to you get to a point in the discussion where you're no longer talking about translating individual words or individual even stories. You're talking about translating culture. Some translators talk about colonizing someone else's culture by translating it into your language, into a language that is not part of the original culture. So yeah, this issue comes up quite a lot. My own response to it is that I try to preserve as much as possible the culture and the language and the voice of the original work. You know, for example, with Yara's novel, I Am Ariel Sharon, she's a Palestinian who's written a novel in which the main character is Israeli. And, you know, so there's all kinds of stuff going on in there. But I've never been to Israel, and I don't know that culture very well. Certainly not as well. I wouldn't write about that culture myself. But as a translator, I know she does. I mean, so my primary concern is to make sure that her knowledge and her sense of the culture that she's writing about is preserved in my English version of that book. It is tricky, and you know, it's a matter of what I said earlier about getting into the characters space, mental space, and preserving that and respecting it, and don't try to make it sound like it comes from somewhere else.
Thank you. I'm just noticing the time. It's 4:38, so I have a few questions, and again, there's space in the chat for our last 20 minutes or so together. Again, thank you all. This is such a rich conversation, and your thoughtful responses to very difficult conversational threads. I noticed that Sanchari wrote in the chat, was it? Yeah, burn it all down. I you know, I've heard that many times before. I wonder, oh, sorry, I'm losing my track here. Criticism is not censorship. That was from Angie our conversation. I thought that was really helpful to hear as well. Criticism, like we're talking about the responses and how they can make us feel if people take exception to our work. And you know, as an emerging writer, I really want to have fun. Like I'd really like to enjoy this. And one of the things that really occurred to me is, wow, like this is a ton of responsibility, and can we also still have fun? I also am really, really interested in social justice work. And in Arif's contribution, he was saying that readers can see through an agenda-ridden book really quickly, especially in fiction. So when we're writing to shine a light on an issue, how do we achieve that goal and have fun and also take responsibility and not have a preachy tone and all of those things? I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
Funny, I'm going to just tell a little short story about that, because I was trying very hard to do the right thing in my novel. I mean, I didn't think about it as I was crafting my novel. I was writing fiction the way I always do, but as we came close to publication, or not close to publication, once the book was accepted, I did a lot of consultation with the cultural liaison at the Tanaha band, and I presented the elders, and so I really was worrying about doing everything right. I included an author's note that was recommended by an elder. I had a lot of comments in my acknowledgements about having done consultation. And then in the meantime, this controversy had erupted in Canada that I had done things wrong and I should have been more careful than I was. But then on Goodreads, some woman who was not Canadian wrote, yes, it is possible to write about people of color, but is it possible to do so without being as much of an uptight dickhead as Angie Abdou is? So I was like, I mean, am I too much of an uptight dickhead or not enough of an uptight dickhead? It depends who you ask. So it's a hard time to have fun as a fiction writer when you're worrying about, and I guess Twitter and Facebook gives us immediate access to all kinds of opinions. So when you're so worried about doing everything wrong, it's paralyzing in terms of actually trying to write fiction. And so I haven't written fiction since that book, and that is deliberate. I'm just worked on some memoir projects, and I'm taking a break to understand what fiction is in this current you know, with the way we're rethinking issues about who you can write and how you can write it. But yeah, fun, I think that's a good question. Where's the where's the fun when we're also worried? But it's a balance, because we're worried about things we need to be worried about, but at the same time, we don't want to lose the joy in writing and storytelling.
Well, Sanchari as well, you had mentioned receiving criticism and gratitude for the same piece. And you chose to focus on the gratitude because that was so valuable and it helped someone so much. But still, it resulted in 2 months of depression and not writing. And so, I mean, is it worth it? I'm curious.
I think it is, because I would say I was still like a very young writer, in the sense, like not age-wise, but as getting seriously into writing. I did not think about the consequences when I wrote the piece that was criticized. And so now, a few years after that whole incident that happened at the retreat that I was at, where I was criticized for the piece, I realized I didn't have the right to write it in the way I did. And it has taken me a lot of even though I do identify as genderqueer myself, I didn't have the right to write about a trans character in that way. And that has taken a lot of self-reflection on my part as well. And even coming into an understanding of what it means for me to be genderqueer, how do I identify as such? And so I'll always be grateful for that. I don't think I have any regrets with that. Yes, okay, I had a few months of depression, but I mean, we had the pandemic and then we had a few months of depression. I mean, shit happens. It's just, it's a learning process. And that's why I think writers, they do have the responsibility to interrogate their work. I think they still have fun. I mean, when you're writing, you're not really thinking about anything. And I don't think you should have to when you're actually in the process of writing. But when you're in the process of revising, you're thinking about putting the work out into the world, yes, that's when you have to interrogate your positionality and responsibility that comes with it. It might hurt as well.
I agree with that. I also would suggest that it's not only in fiction that those issues come up, but in nonfiction as well, maybe even more poignantly in nonfiction. In my first book, I was sent to China to write a book about some paleontological work that was being done there, and I was in China in 1990, which was the year after Tiananmen Square, and we spent 2 months in the Gobi Desert digging dinosaurs alongside our Chinese colleagues, some of whom had been students in Tiananmen Square the year before. And so obviously we talked and we talked about what had gone on and what their feelings were and how they felt about it. And I came back and I put that conversation in my book, in one of the chapters of the book. And the people who I'd been working with in China and in Canada called me in and asked me to take that chapter out and to not report on what those students had said to me. It had never occurred to me that I was putting anybody in any jeopardy by reporting on their conversations or recording or repeating their conversations. But it was pointed out to me that those students that I had talked to and who had said those things about the Chinese government could easily be rounded up and killed. So, it was not a question of whether, ethical question then. I mean, I just took that out. Of course I did. But, it was a lesson to me to be aware, as you were saying, to be aware of the implications and the consequences of what you're doing as a writer.
Thank you. That's a great example. It reminds me of Carol Off's experience as well, about the Afghani warlords. And,
oh, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, that was just a squirrel passing by that I was following. I was curious too, like you've mentioned this as a process, and I really respect that orientation. I feel like complexity is kind of the nature of human living these days, and uncertainty, and negotiating that, navigating that, figuring that out together in groups. And I believe, it was Farzana's conversation in the book where Farzana, you talked about, even with this book, with 7, that it was reading Dorothy Palmer's book called Falling for Myself that was helpful in doing a revision, doing an editing. And thanks for that distinction, Sanchari, between writing and then the editing and revising process. That's very true. That reading Falling for Myself from Dorothy Palmer was helpful to increase your mindfulness around ableism in writing. Who do you think? Yeah. Do you think that Inappropriate and this collection and what's gone into this Daniel Heath Justice's essay, all of this process we're putting out into the world, do you think it can help people in that revision section or that revision editing process?
Definitely. That's I think where we want it to be. Everyone has talked about when we're writing, we should just be writing. And then we need to be really thoughtful and mindful about, what is it that we're writing? Are we the right person to write it? How do we make sure that we're being respectful, all of that. So yeah, so, in terms of ableism in writing, and, it's always going to be a learning process, but it did help me to kind of spotlight a couple of things in my book, and also in how the back cover material was being written by the marketing folks, and how I wanted to shift that. So I think these kinds of things just allow us, to keep learning, and to keep doing our anti-oppression work. But yeah, I think it's always for revision and editing, not for the actual writing.
Just to say, that can be massive revisions and edits, right? Like with my novel In Case I Go, before I did stages of approaching different people, and after my editor said we need to do more consultation around the Indigenous characters in this book, I first approached my cousin Frank Bush, who's a Cree Lakota Syrian writer who wrote a book called Grey Owl. And he read a draft of the book, and it was a ghost story at that point. Mary was a ghost, and the first thing he said to me is, well, Mary can't be a ghost. He had all these criticism, and one was like, Mary can't be a ghost. There's taboos around having ghosts in Indigenous cultures. You're implying that she's area of the past, whereas Eli's more solid in the world, which is, of course, a great point, and I'm glad he said it to me, and I'm glad I made that change. But that's a totally different book. I had written a ghost story because I live in this place where there's graves all over scattered. There was poor grave marking in the area. So that's what started the book, is I was writing about a place on graves, and then that became a metaphor for the issues of our ancestors that haunt us, and how we have to how the younger generations live with that haunting. But yeah, so it started as a ghost story. The first constructive feedback my cousin Frank gave me was, this can't be a ghost story. So those revisions can be massive, even if you leave, so not to I don't want to say, I just want to make it clear that when we say leave that for the revision stage, that revision might be huge rewriting.
Yeah, for sure. Arif, you mentioned that too in our conversation, that you did, I think, 1.5 years of revisions for your agent. And then after that, you were able to find a publisher. And then once you found a publisher, you did another year of revisions. So we really have to love this process, right? And I also feel like this speaks to that idea of process. And I want to kind of get closer to the end of this by talking a little bit about the writing process, and is it transformative for you? I'm a big fan of Jael Richardson, and I follow her on Twitter, and she wrote yesterday, just write. She says, if there's one thing I know, writing changes everything. And I thought that was interesting. And Mahak, in your piece, you were talking about all text being artifice, and that perhaps writers understand the world better through writing because it helps them see the artifice that also exists in the world around them. And I find writing transformative. I think that's why journal writing is even prescribed by therapists. I feel like there's a human element that can move and shift through writing and reading. So I'm just wondering, do you find the writing process transformative?
I'll just quickly say yes. I wouldn't write if I didn't. That's all it's about for me, is that kind of transformation. And in the case of In Case I Go, it was transformative, not just of my inner life, but I really solidified the bonds with the Indigenous side of my family, because we're such a massive family. It's not like we all get together, the hundreds and hundreds of us all the time, but Frank Bush was so helpful when I was working on this book, and we became really close. And then through him, I become close with that whole part of the family. And so that's a massive transformation in my life and the life of my children. I think of it, even if the book bombed in some ways with all that happened, I think of it as it was a personal reconciliation at the level of my family, which has been worth it all.
Arif wrote in the chat, writing is the cheapest form of vacation I can take.
I think there's a danger though of thinking of writing as being therapeutic in the sense, or transformative in the sense that it will solve some of your problems, or that you will solve some problems by writing about them. In my own case, I don't think writing about something leads to an answer, and I don't think it should. Lots of people have said fiction doesn't give answers. It just raises the questions, keeps the questions in front of people. And to me, writing about something that is deeply moving and deeply part of what I'm trying to express is actually stirs up some of those things more than calms them down. So yes, it's transformative in a sense that, which is why I think it's recommended by therapists, in that it settles for the writer what issues are stirring up deep inside. I'm not sure that it resolves those issues.
Yeah, great point, great distinction. It's 4:53. I have run out of sticky notes. And I'm really opening it up to all of us to share any last thoughts, any last questions.
I was just going to say that I feel like for me, the writing process is a way of engaging with reflection, and just pausing, especially in a time or a life that feels very rushed. So it sort of enacts that pausing process, that meditative process. And if I'm just doing that for myself, that's where it sits. Though I think as writers writing for an audience, it's also about, can you enact that for somebody reading it? That same sort of reflective process, or engaging with that muscle, so to speak, for somebody else. Not, I don't pick up a novel expecting it to solve my problems, but more so to engage me with something that I otherwise find myself difficult to access in my life and to engage with for just a moment.
I just wanted to add that maybe an add-on to that question that you asked him earlier is like transformative for whom, which also kind of goes along with just what Mahak said too. Like if you're writing it for yourself, and depending on what you're writing, it can be, or it may be really painful. But then depending on who ends up with your book, like for me, I'm working on a collection of short stories that have queer South Asian characters. And so I know that I am writing for queer people like me who grew up without seeing themselves in stories. And I think maybe, at least I hope that these stories will help somebody like me, because I didn't have these stories that reflected me back. But personally, it was transformative for me. I don't know if these specific stories are, but I know when I do other writing, some of my other writing has been helpful in thinking through and like how I see the world. So in that level, in that sense, yeah.
Thank you. Yes, it brings me also to this question about having a social justice agenda or a theme in our writing, and whether that's a different writing process. Farzana, I want to pose that to you. Was writing 7 very different from writing All Inclusive, or maybe they all had a social justice bent? I'm not sure.
They all do. I can't separate that from myself. Just like I can't separate the psychotherapist out of me. So there's often like psychological elements in all of my books. So no, but I think what I've tried to do with each book is to write a really good story, and then you fold in those social justice issues within the story, so that people can explore sometimes difficult issues in a way that is digestible, and also is, I don't know, like it becomes relatable, right? Because you're relating through story, through character, through plot. Yeah.
I found when I was teaching creative nonfiction, I wish I had a background in psychotherapy, because a lot of times in a workshop, you are doing psychotherapeutic work, whether you know what you're doing or not, because of things that come up in people who, many people writing memoirs and writing about very traumatic and difficult experiences. I found myself like wishing I knew more about how to handle those situations.
That's a great point. I studied in a previous lifetime music therapy, and I worked as a music therapist. And when I wrote and the piece that I was published in Prairie Fire, I was so surprised by the process, how it really took me over, and the kind of depth that it went to. And I guess, I don't know about you, Farzana, but in the healing arts and in the healing field, it's almost like a drug, right? Like you just want to do that all the time because you just see the value of it, or I do. And so I pursued that, but it was really extreme, like the emotional process of writing about those stories and the impact of that. And I want to just do a little plug here for Inkwell in Toronto. It's a wonderful organization that uses creative writing as a tool for enjoyment, and also for participants who have a lived experience with mental health issues. And I'll be moderating a panel with them on November the 14th for Inkfest. It's their online fundraiser, because due to the lockdown and the shutdown, due to the pandemic, they weren't able to have their annual fundraiser. So I encourage you all to check that out and support it. Also, Vanessa's put a couple of things in the chat just before we go. This book, Inappropriate, is available through Gordon Hill Press website, so the link is there. And you can also get full bundles of the fall titles from Gordon Hill Press, including M. Travis Lane's Keeping Count and Lily Wang's Saturn Peach there. And thank you, Mahak, for putting Inkwell Workshops on there. You can check that out on inkwellworkshops.com. Arif, sorry, so we still have 2 minutes. Arif, I haven't heard from you for a little while. Do you have any final closing thoughts?
I feel like I may have inadvertently dominated the conversation, so I'm just happy to be quiet now. But I really enjoyed everything.
Yes, and we enjoyed all of your contributions. Thank you for being so generous with your thoughts. And everyone, thank you. This has been really enriching. There, we can read the little streaming. It's so fun, right? Like these technology things, to be able to do so many things at once. And I bet somebody's even watching Netflix at the same time. Like they're just
split screen.
Thank you very much. Any final words? I'll hand it over to Vanessa and Jeremy. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks from me and from Shane too. We had to leave a bit early. Really appreciate everybody's contributions. None of this happens without a lot of people, as I said at the beginning, but also, this whole community doesn't happen without readers, and we really appreciate you guys showing up and participating in the process, and hopefully the conversation continues. That's the idea. So, Vanessa, anything to end us off with?
I think it was all covered. There are the links again in the chat to buy the book. If you want to do the bundle with the other fall releases, that is available on the website as well. Also, I just also want to say thank you for the conversation today. And I thought that also everyone contributing in the chat was really nice, and like that is like an engaging conversation. It's welcoming to other people to like join in and share thoughts and their own questions that people had. So yeah, I thought this was great. So thank you everyone for reading and for sharing.
Thank you. Bye.
Good night. Bye.
Bye.